When my father sneered that I didn't belong at the White House, I didn't argue. I'm Theodora 39, an industrial weld integrity metallurgist from Erie. He thought stealing my structural patent secured his legacy. He forgot I'm the one who certifies the steel. If you've ever sat at a faded laminate kitchen table in the middle of the night, staring at a document that bears your signature except you know for a fact you never signed it, then you know the exact temperature of the ice that fills your veins. I'm 39 years old, and for 15 of those years, I've been the quiet spine of Vance Marine Structures. While my father, Arthur Vance, shook hands at Chamber of Commerce dinners in his custom-tailored wool blazers, and my younger brother Julian spent his afternoons playing golf with local developers, I was down in the dry docks. I've spent winters where the wind coming off Lake Erie feels like a wet razor blade, holding an ultrasonic transducer against freezing steel plates, looking for microscopic pockets of air that could cause a hull to split under pressure. My hands are rough. I don't wear jewelry because a ring can catch on a structural rib and take your finger right off. My luxury was my work. I knew every weld, every seam, and every stress point of every barge and tugboat we ever put into the water. But to my father, I was always just the technician. A useful utility. Theo is great in the back room, Arthur would tell clients, his voice booming with that false, practiced warmth of a man who has never actually swung a hammer. She's got her mother's quiet focus. But Julian is the vision. Julian's vision had recently landed our family firm in a $3 million hole after he mismanaged a deepwater bulkhead installation in Cleveland. We were staring down the barrel of a devastating breach of contract lawsuit that would have liquidated everything my grandfather had built. I knew we were in trouble. What I didn't know was how far my father would go to save his golden boy from the consequences of his owning. It happened on a rainy Tuesday in late October. I was in my small office at the back of the fabrication yard, the smell of ozone and wet iron heavy in the air, when my younger sister, Clara, came in. Clara is a local elementary school teacher, the only one in the family who doesn't work for the company, and she has always been my anchor. She was holding a manila envelope, her knuckles white, her eyes red-rimmed from crying. "Theo," she whispered, her voice shaking as she pulled a heavy stack of papers from the envelope. I was helping Dad organize his desk for the tax auditors. I found these in his private filing drawer. You need to look at them. Right now. I wiped the grease off my fingers with a rag and pulled the documents toward me. It was a patent application for the acoustic emission fracture mapping protocol, a non-destructive testing method that uses high-frequency sound waves to predict structural failures in deep-water steel welds before they can even be seen by the human eye. It was my life's work. I had spent 5 years developing it, working late into the night at my kitchen table, drinking lukewarm chamomile tea while my back ached, writing the proprietary software code that translated acoustic feedback into three-dimensional stress maps. But as I scrolled down to the inventor signature page, my heart stopped. There was my name, printed in block letters, but the signature next to it was a clumsy, digitized forgery of my handwriting. Attached to it was an intellectual property assignment deed. It stated that I, Theodora Vance, had voluntarily transferred all rights, royalties, and future licensing profits of the acoustic emission protocol to Vance Marine Structures for the sum of $1. Below that, on the final page of the filing, was the designated lead inventor of record, Julian Vance. My own father had forged my name to strip me of my intellectual property, handing my life's achievement to my brother on a silver platter, and they had already used it. The documents showed they had submitted the patented protocol as their proprietary technology to win a massive $40 million federal harbor restoration contract funded by the Department of Transportation. They didn't just take it, Theo, Clara sobbed, reaching across my metal desk to grab my hand. Her palms were warm, a stark contrast to my frozen fingers. They're using it to bail out Julian's mess in Cleveland. I heard Dad talking to the corporate lawyers on the phone. They're planning to restructure the company. They're going to phase you out. Dad said you were redundant now that the technology is secured in Julian's name. Redundant. The word felt like a physical blow to the chest. I had spent my entire adult life protecting their reputation, fixing Julian's structural mistakes in the dead of night so the company wouldn't get sued, and keeping my mouth shut while they took the credit. I did it because I believed in family. I believed that if I worked hard enough, if I was loyal enough, my father would eventually see me. Truly see me. Adruli see me. But he only saw a tool to be used until it was blunt and then discarded. I didn't scream. I didn't cry. If you work with steel long enough, you learn that when metal is heated to its limit, it doesn't make a sound. It just changes structure. That was the moment my structure changed. Don't say a word to them. Clara, I said, my voice incredibly quiet, almost gentle. Not a single word. 2 weeks later, the official announcement came down from the executive office. Vance Marine Structures had been awarded the federal contract. Not only that, but because of the revolutionary safety innovations developed by Julian Vance, the company had been selected to be honored at a special American infrastructure renewal ceremony at the White House in Washington, D.C. It was the pinnacle of my father's social ambition. He had spent his whole life wanting to walk through those historic doors, to rub shoulders with cabinet secretaries and senators, to prove to the world that the boy from the Erie shipyards had finally made it to the top. The morning the invitations arrived, my father called a mandatory all-hands meeting in the main fabrication shop. The workers, men and women in dirt-streaked canvas jackets, who had known me since I was an apprentice, stood in a semicircle around a temporary wooden stage. Arthur stood up there, flanked by Julian, who was wearing a brand-new Italian suit that looked absurd against the backdrop of our rusted overhead cranes. This is a historic day for Vance Marine. Arthur boomed, his voice echoing off the corrugated metal ceiling. He held up a thick, cream-colored card with a gold-embossed seal. We have been invited to the White House. The president himself will be presenting U.S. with the National Infrastructure Innovation Award. This award belongs to our brilliant Vice President of Engineering, Julian Vance, whose groundbreaking safety protocol has set a new standard for American manufacturing. The workers clapped, but it was a polite, hesitant sound. They knew who actually spent her nights in the dirt testing those welds. Many of them looked over at me, standing near the back by the tool lockers, my hands buried deep in the pockets of my grease-stained work jacket. Julian smiled, waving to the crowd like a politician. He looked at me, a smirk playing on his lips, his eyes filled with a cruel, triumphant satisfaction. He knew what he had stolen. He just didn't think I had the stomach to do anything about it. After the meeting dispersed, I walked toward the front offices to grab my logbooks. As I passed the conference room, my father stepped out, closing the door behind him. He looked down at my work boots, then up at my face, his expression hardening into that cold, dismissive mask I had known my entire childhood. "I suppose you think you should be going to Washington, Theo," he said, his tone dry and biting. "It is my technology, Dad," I said, keeping my voice perfectly level. I wrote every line of that code. I calibrated every sensor. Arthur scoffed, stepping closer, smelling of expensive cologne and stale coffee. "You're a technician, Theo. You look good in a hard hat. But, let's be honest, you don't have the polish for a room like that. You don't belong in rooms with carpets that cost more than your yearly salary." Julian is the face of this company. He represents our future. You've been compensated for your time here. If you can't be a team player, maybe it's time you found a yard that suits your limited social skills. He reached into his pocket and pulled out his own VIP invitation, waving the heavy cream card right in front of my face, his eyes gleaming with a mixture of arrogance and warning. "Don't make a scene, Theo," he warned, his voice dropping to a low, menacing hiss. "You don't belong there. You never did. Hostess era, keep the shop running, and let the real leaders represent this family." He turned on his heel and walked away, his leather shoes clicking sharply on the polished concrete floor, leaving me standing alone in the shadow of the heavy machinery. I watched his retreating back, my hand resting on the cold steel of a nearby structural beam. I felt the vibration of the shop floor, the steady, rhythmic pulse of the heavy presses. My father thought he had built a fortress of lies that I could never penetrate. He thought my silence was weakness. He didn't realize that in my 15 years of inspecting welds, I had learned how to find the single, microscopic point of vulnerability that could bring an entire mountain of steel crashing down with a single tap. They were going to Washington, and so was I. If you have ever had to build a case against your own blood, You already know it is not like the movies. There are no dramatic courtroom speeches, no sudden theatrical confessions. It is a quiet, exhausting, and incredibly lonely process. It happens in the dead of night, under the harsh glare of a single desk lamp, surrounded by mountains of paper that smell of stale ink and old dust. It is the sound of a scanner worry at 2 in the morning while the rest of the world is asleep, and the constant, dull ache in your chest that comes from knowing that every document you copy is another nail in the coffin of your family. I sat at my kitchen table that night, the linoleum cold beneath my bare feet. A single mug of peppermint tea was cooling beside me, the steam rising and disappearing into the shadows of the ceiling. Clara sat opposite me, her eyes heavy with sleep, but her face set in a grim expression of determination. She wore a faded, oversized gray cardigan with stretched-out cuffs, the one she always wore when she was grading papers late into the night. "Are you sure about this, Theo?" she whispered, her voice barely louder than the hum of the refrigerator. "Once we pull these threads, there's no sewing it back together. Dad will lose the company. Julian could go to prison." I looked down at the battered orange-cased rugged hard drive sitting on the table between us. Inside that little piece of rubberized plastic was the entire history of my life's work. Every algorithm, every raw acoustic data file, every calibration log from the freezing dry docks. "They didn't just steal my work, Clara," I said, my voice steady despite the tremor in my hands. "They forged my name on a federal document to do it. They lied to the government to secure a $40 million harbor contract. If that bulkhead in Cleveland fails because Julian doesn't actually understand how to implement my safety protocol, people will die. Real people, men and women who work the docks just like I do. I won't let my silence be the reason a family doesn't come home at night." I know some of you are sitting at your own tables right now, weighing the cost of speaking up against the comfort of keeping the peace. You think if you just swallow the pain, if you just let them have this one last thing, the storm will pass. But let me tell you what I learned in the cold light of that kitchen. A thief's hunger is never satisfied. If you let them take your work, they will eventually come back for your dignity. The next morning, I began the meticulous process of gathering my proof. I started with the signature. I took the digitized patent assignment deed to a retired state police document examiner named Ronald Chun, who ran a small, cramped office above a dry cleaner's in downtown Erie. The air in his office smelled of solvent and old paper. Ronald was a man in his late 60s with thick spectacles and a quiet, methodical way of moving. He spent 3 hours comparing the signature on the assignment deed with 20 different safety logs I had signed by hand over the past decade. He didn't say a word for the first 2 hours, just adjusted his magnifying lamp and peered through his microscope. Finally, he leaned back, taking off his glasses to rub his eyes. "It's a tracing, Theodora," he said, pointing a yellowed finger at the screen of his monitor. "A highly precise digital trace. Look at the pressure points. In a real signature, your hand naturally varies the weight of the pen based on the surface and your grip. This signature has a perfectly uniform digital width. But more importantly, look at the alignment." He overlaid the patent signature with my signature from a December 2018 EPA compliance log. They matched pixel for pixel. "No human being signs their name exactly the same way twice," Ronald said softly. "It is physically impossible. This is a digital clone of your 2018 signature. Whoever did this copy-pasted it from your old digital safety logs. I can write you a certified forensic report that will hold up in any federal court in the land." I paid him in cash, took the certified report, and placed it inside a hard-sided black portfolio. But the signature was only the first lock. I needed the keys to the technical vault. You see, my father and Julian thought that having the patent certificate was enough. They thought a piece of paper with a gold seal made them the owners of the technology. But they didn't understand the science. They didn't know that my acoustic emission fracture mapping protocol relied on a highly proprietary software code that I had written myself. To prove I was the sole creator, I needed to show the digital lineage of that code. I logged into my private Git repository, a secure, cloud-based platform where developers store their programming history. Every single time I had written a line of code over the last 5 years, I had committed it to this repository. Each commit was automatically stamped with an immutable cryptographic SHA-256 security code that cannot be altered, forged, or backdated. It showed the exact second, minute, hour, day, and year that I had created every single algorithm. My brother Julian didn't even know what a Git repository was. He thought software was something you just downloaded from an app store. I printed out the complete cryptographic history of the software, showing a 5-year timeline of continuous development, long before Julian had ever even heard the words acoustic emission. The final piece of the puzzle was the federal connection. Because Vance Marine had used this fraudulent patent to secure a contract funded by the Department of Transportation, this wasn't just a civil dispute between family members. It was procurement fraud against the United States government. I didn't go to the local police. They knew my father. He bought them tickets to charity galas and donated to their pension funds. Instead, I bypassed them entirely and contacted the Office of the Inspector General OEG. For the Department of Transportation. 2 days later, I found myself sitting in a windowless conference room in the federal building in Pittsburgh. Across from me sat Special Agent Evelyn Thorne. She was a sharp, middle-aged woman with short, silver-streaked hair and eyes that looked like they had seen every variety of human greed and deception the world had to offer. She wore a simple dark blue suit and didn't have any paper on her desk, just a sleek, black government laptop. I laid out my documents one by one. The forensic handwriting report, the cryptographic code history, the original raw metallurgical test files, and finally, the forged patent assignment deed. Agent Thorne didn't interrupt me. She just listened, her fingers occasionally tapping a rhythm on the side of her laptop. When I finished, she looked at the documents, 10 up, at me, her expression unreadable. "This is incredibly thorough. Ms. Vance," she said, her voice cool and professional. "You've handed us a complete case on a silver platter. The False Statements Act is very clear on this. If your father and brother submitted these forged documents to secure a federal bid, they have committed a major felony." "I know," I said, my throat dry. "It will destroy their company," she warned, leaning forward. "And because of the high profile of the National Infrastructure Innovation Award, this is going to be very public. The White House ceremony is in 2 weeks. They are scheduled to receive the award from the president himself." I took a deep breath, reaching into my pocket. My fingers wrapped around a small, heavy object, my grandfather's vintage brass micrometer, its metal worn smooth from decades of use. He had given it to me when I passed my first welding certification. Asterisk, never measure twice, to fit a lie. Theo, asterisk, he had told me. Asterisk, the metal always knows the truth. Asterisk, I pulled it out and set it on the table. It was a humble, scratched piece of brass, but it represented the only legacy that actually mattered to me. My grandfather built that company on honesty. Agent Thorne, I said, looking her straight in the eye. My father and brother are using his name to sell a lie. They are going to that ceremony to accept an award for something they stole from me. I want them to stand in that room, in front of everyone they've ever wanted to impress. Agent Thorne's lips curved into a very faint, dangerous smile. "And what do you want us to do?" "I want to be there," I said. "I don't want to stop them from entering. I want them to walk into that trap themselves. But I need a pass. A real one that lets me carry the truth right into the heart of that room." She looked at the brass micrometer. 10 bake at me. She closed her laptop with a soft, DCC bay click. "The Department of Transportation has a technical advisory seat for the award committee," Agent Thorne said quietly. "We have the authority to issue a special high-clearance guest of honor pass for technical verification. I will personally authorize your credential. Ms. Vance, your father and brother think they are going to Washington to celebrate their crowning achievement. We will let them think that, right up until the moment the curtain falls." As I walked out of the federal building into the cold, gray Pittsburgh rain, I felt the first real sense of peace I had known in months. The weight was still there, but it was no longer crushing me. It was a structural weight now, one I knew exactly how to balance. My father had told me I didn't belong in rooms with expensive carpets. He had told me to stay in the dirt of the shipyards where I belonged. But he had forgotten the most basic rule of engineering. The foundation is always built in the dirt, and if you destroy the foundation, the entire house comes crashing down. If you've ever had to sit across a table from someone who thinks they have completely, utterly broken you and you have to smile, nod, and pass them the salt, then you know the kind of acting it takes to survive. It's not the Hollywood kind. It's the kind where your ribcage feels like a cage of hot wire, but you keep your breathing shallow and your eyes perfectly still. That was my life for the 10 days following my meeting with Agent Thorne. Back at the Erie Yard, the atmosphere was thick with a manic, celebratory energy that made my stomach turn. My father had corporate banners printed and hung from the rusted rafters of the main fabrication shop, screaming *Vance Marine, shaping the future of American infrastructure * in bold, vinyl lettering. He had booked first-class flights to Washington, D.C., and reserved a suite of rooms at a historic hotel near the Capitol that cost more per night than I made in a month. He was in his element, holding court in the front office, his booming laugh echoing down the hallway every time a local politician called to congratulate him. And then there was Julian. My younger brother suddenly started walking through the yard with his chin tilted up, wearing a shiny new hard hat that didn't have a single scratch or speck of grease on it. He had a brand new gold watch that caught the pale autumn sunlight every time he gestured toward the dry docks, pointing out his technological achievements to visiting local reporters. I stayed in the background. He wore my oil-stained canvas work jacket, kept my safety glasses on, and spent my days with my head down, scanning the structural seams of a coal barge. I was a ghost in my own family's business. One afternoon, 3 days before we were scheduled to leave for Washington, Julian walked into my small office at the back of the yard. He didn't knock, he just pushed the metal door open, letting in the cold blast of wind from the lake and the screech of the overhead gantry cranes. He stood there, looking down at my cluttered desk, which was piled high with raw ultrasonic data sheets and half-empty boxers of welding rods. "Theo," he said, his voice carrying that lazy, patronizing tone he always used when he wanted something, but didn't want to admit he needed my help. "I'm going over the final talking points for the White House press brief. The Department of Transportation's technical liaison sent over a question about the calibration coefficients for the shear-wave transducer array. Some academic nonsense. What's the quick answer for that?" I looked up at him. I looked at his clean hands, his manicured nails, and the expensive wool coat he had draped over his shoulders. He didn't have the slightest idea what a shear-wave transducer actually did. He didn't know that if you didn't calibrate the sensor to account for the specific carbon density of the steel, the entire acoustic reading was useless. He was a man trying to explain the mechanics of flight while standing on the ground, holding a paper airplane. I felt a sudden, sharp urge to tell him the truth, to scream at him, to watch the color drain from his face as he realized I knew about the forged signature, the stolen patent, and the federal investigation. But I thought of the cold, steady weight of my grandfather's brass micrometer in my pocket. I thought of the quiet promise I had made to Agent Thorne. So, I took a slow breath and let the heat drain out of my voice. "Just tell them we use a standardized baseline of 5.9 kilometers per second for the longitudinal wave velocity. Julian," I said, my voice flat and completely devoid of emotion. "They won't press you on the math. They just want to hear that the system is automated." Julian smiled, a smug, relieved expression crossing his face. He actually tapped the side of his shiny hard hat with 2 fingers. "Perfect. Perfect. Automated. That's the word the politicians like. Good job, Theo. I knew I could count on you to keep the gears greased while we handle the big picture stuff." He turned and walked out, leaving the door swinging open. I sat there in the silence, watching the dust motes dance in the pale light. He had no idea that the numbers I had just given him were the standard default settings for structural aluminum, not marine-grade carbon steel. If he repeated those numbers to a federal engineer who actually knew their business, he would look like an amateur who had never set foot in a laboratory. I hadn't lied to him. I had simply given him exactly what he asked for, the superficial, automated answer of a technician who didn't care enough to save him from his own ignorance. The night before the trip, Clara came over to my small, rented house near the docks. The wind was howling off Lake Erie, rattling the loose storm windows of my kitchen. We sat at my faded laminate table. The same table where I had spent hundreds of hours writing the software code they had stolen from me. Between us sat my mother's old tin of Royal Dansk butter cookies. It didn't contain cookies, of course. It held our mother's old sewing kit, filled with mismatched buttons, safety pins, and spools of green and blue thread. Clara was using a needle to carefully mend the hem of my only nice outfit, a simple, navy blue wrap dress I had bought on clearance at a department store in Cleveland 3 years ago. "You're really going to do this, aren't you?" Clara asked quietly. Her eyes focused on the tiny, neat stitches she was making. Her voice was thick, and I could see the tension in her shoulders. "I have to, Clara," I said, holding a warm mug of chamomile tea between my rough, calloused palms. "If I don't, I'm agreeing to my own disappearance. I'm telling Dad and Julian that my life, my work, and my dignity are theirs to trade for a handshake in Washington." Clara stopped sewing. She looked up at me, her eyes glistening with unshed tears. "I'm scared for you, Theo. When the truth comes out, Dad is going to turn into a monster. He'll call you a traitor. He'll tell everyone you did this out of jealousy because you couldn't make it as a leader." "Let him," I said softly, reaching across the table to squeeze her hand. Her skin was soft, the hand of a teacher who held chalk and books, while mine was rough from decades of handling raw iron. "The metal always knows the truth, Clara. You can lie to the banks, you can lie to the papers, and you can even lie to the President of the United States. But you cannot lie to a weld. If it is weak, it will fail. And their lie is the weakest weld I've ever seen." She squeezed my hand back, a tear finally escaping and rolling down her cheek. "I'll be waiting by the phone. The minute it's over, you call me." When she left, I went to my bedroom and packed my bag. I didn't have a set of luxury luggage like the matching leather suitcases my father had bought for the trip. I had a faded blue canvas duffel bag with a broken zipper pull that I had replaced with a heavy-duty metal paperclip. Inside, I carefully folded the navy dress, packed a pair of sensible black flats, and placed my black portfolio containing the forensic handwriting report and the cryptographic code history at the very bottom, lying flat against the cardboard insert. On top of the portfolio, I placed the special high-clearance guest pass that Agent Thorne had sent to my private post office box. It was a heavy, laminated card with a silver holographic border and a large black and white QR code printed in the center. It didn't have the Vance Marine logo on it. It had the official seal of the United States Department of Transportation, and below that, my name printed in cleany, authoritative block letters. Theodora Vance, Technical Advisor. Asterisk. The next morning, I didn't go to the airport with my father and brother. They had taken a private town car to the Cleveland airport at 5 in the morning, laughing and talking about the senators they were going to meet. Instead, I walked through the damp, gray, eerie morning to the local Amtrak station. I boarded the 6:15 a.m. train to Washington, D.C. The train ride was long, rhythmic, and peaceful. For 8 hours, I watched the industrial landscape of Pennsylvania roll past my window, the rusted skeletons of old steel mills, the quiet coal towns tucked into the folds of the gray hills, and the endless stretches of timberland. The steady, heavy hum of the steel wheels on the tracks felt like a comforting hand on my shoulder. It was the sound of honest work. The sound of machines that didn't lie, moving people across a country built by hands just like mine. I arrived in Washington late in the afternoon. The city was a stark contrast to Erie. It was grand, clean, and filled with massive white marble buildings that looked like they had been carved out of solid mountain peaks. The air was crisp, smelling of wet asphalt and fallen leaves. I took a public bus to a modest motel in Arlington, just across the river from the city center. My room smelled of industrial carpet cleaner and cheap lavender soap, but it was clean. From my window I could see the distant, glowing dome of the Capitol building rising against the darkening sky. I hung my navy dress in the small metal closet, hoping the steam from the shower would take out the wrinkles. Then, I sat on the edge of the bed and pulled the laminated pass from my bag. I ran my thumb over the raised plastic edges of the QR code. This little piece of code was the key that would unlock the door my father had slammed in my face. He thought he had locked me out of the room where the decisions were made. He thought his wealth, his tailored suits, and his forged papers had made him invincible. But he had forgotten that I was the one who built the locks. Tomorrow, they would walk into the White House, carrying a stolen trophy and a mountain of lies. And I would be right behind them, holding the key that would bring it all down. The East Room of the White House is larger than it looks on television, but to someone who has spent her life inside the cavernous bays of industrial fabrication shops, it still felt like a container. A very expensive, highly polished container, but a container nonetheless. The ceilings were high, adorned with massive crystal chandeliers that caught the light and scattered it in 1,000 tiny, glittering pieces across the walls. The floor beneath my feet was polished wood, clean enough to eat off of, reflecting the soft glow of the lamps. It was a room designed to make ordinary people feel small. It was designed to make you look up, to make you whisper, to make you feel as though you had entered a sanctuary of power where the messy, grease-stained reality of the world outside could never penetrate. I stood near the edge of the room, my back close to a heavy silk drapery that smelled faintly of lavender and old dust. My navy blue wrap dress, the one Clara had so carefully mended at my kitchen table the night before, felt simple, almost stark against the backdrop of custom-tailored suits and silk gowns that rustled like dry leaves every time the guests moved. I wore my sensible black flats. My hands, still rough and marked by faint, silver scars from stray welding sparks, were clasped loosely in front of me. I didn't have a glass of champagne. I didn't need one. My hands were steady, but my chest felt tight. The way it does just before a storm rolls in over Lake Erie, when the air pressure drops so fast your ears pop. If you've ever stood in a room where every single light is shining, surrounded by people who are laughing and clinking glasses, while carrying a secret that could level the building, then you know the heavy, static electricity that fills your lungs. You don't breathe deeply. You just watch. You watch the way people move, the way they position themselves to be seen, the way they offer their hand to someone more important, while looking over that person's shoulder to see who else has just walked through the door. I spotted my father and Julian almost immediately. They were standing near the center of the room, beneath the largest chandelier, surrounded by a small group of men in dark suits who wore small, American flag pins on their lapels. Arthur was in his element. His custom-tailored wool blazer fit him perfectly. His silver hair brushed back, his face flushed with the warm, red glow of a man who believed he had finally conquered his destiny. He was talking with his hands, gesturing broadly, no doubt explaining the visionary engineering that had saved the Cleveland Bulkhead project. Julian stood beside him, nodding eagerly, his shiny gold watch catching the light every time he took a sip from his glass. He looked like a prince who had just been handed a kingdom he didn't know how to run, but was fully prepared to rule anyway. They hadn't seen me yet. To them, I was back in Erie, probably sitting in my cramped office with a cold cup of coffee, checking weld logs for a barge that would never bear their names. And then, Arthur's eyes swept the room. He froze. His laughter died mid-sentence, his hand hovering in the air as his gaze locked onto me. I didn't look away. I didn't flinch. I just stood there, my hands clasped, watching him with the same flat, measuring look I used when inspecting a structural seam. I saw the confusion on his face turn to disbelief, and then, very quickly, into a cold, dark fury. He muttered something to the congressional staffer he was talking to, tapped Julian on the shoulder, and began walking toward me. His stride was long and aggressive, the heavy leather soles of his shoes striking the polished floor with a rhythmic, angry click. Julian followed a step behind, his smirk slipping for a fraction of a second before hardening into a mask of pure arrogance. "Theodora," my father hissed as he reached me. His voice kept low to avoid drawing the attention of the surrounding guests, but vibrating with a terrifying rage. "What in God's name are you doing here? How did you even get past the outer gates?" "I took the train, Dad," I said, my voice perfectly level, almost conversational. "It was a very nice ride." Julian stepped forward, leaning in close, smelling of expensive bourbon and peppermint. "This isn't a joke, Theo. This is a secure federal event. You don't have a security clearance. You don't have an invitation. If you think you're going to make a scene because you're jealous, you're sadly mistaken. They have Secret Service agents in every corner of this room. They will drag you out of here in handcuffs." I'm not here to make a scene, Julian, I said softly. Arthur scoffed, reaching into the breast pocket of his blazer. He pulled out his own VIP invitation, the thick, cream-colored card with the gold-embossed seal of the White House. He waved it right in front of my face, his eyes gleaming with a mixture of hatred and desperate pride. "Look at this, Theo," he whispered, his voice dropping to a menacing, jagged edge. "This is what gets you into this room. This is for the leaders, the people who actually build things. You're a technician, Theo. You're a utility. You belong in a hard hat, covered in grease, not standing on carpets that cost more than your yearly salary. You don't belong here. You never did. Now, turn around, walk out of those doors, and go back to Erie before I have security throw you out and ruin whatever little career you have left." If you have ever had your own father look at you with that much disgust, you know that there is a moment where your heart wants to break. It wants to shrink back, to apologize, to pretend that you are indeed small, just to make the anger stop. But as I looked at him, I didn't feel small. I looked at his custom blazer, his manicured hands, his gold-embossed card, and all I saw was a very fragile, very frightened man who had built his entire life on a foundation of stolen sand. I didn't say a word. I didn't argue. I didn't defend my work or my right to be in the room. I simply reached into my small black clutch, pulled out the heavy, laminated pass Agent Thorne had given me, and walked past them toward the main security checkpoint at the double oak doors, leading into the East Room's official presentation area. Arthur and Julian followed me, their faces twisted in a mixture of anger and panic. "Stop her," Arthur muttered to Julian. "Get her out of here." At the door stood a young hostess in a sharp black pantsuit with a gold eagle lapel pin, holding a heavy digital tablet connected to the White House security grid. Beside her stood a tall, broad-shouldered Secret Service agent with an earpiece, his eyes scanning the crowd with a cold, professional detachment. "Excuse me, ma'am," my father said, pushing past me to address the hostess, his voice instantly shifting back into that smooth, authoritative tone he used with clients. He held up his cream-colored VIP card. "My name is Arthur Vance, president of Vance Marine Structures. This is my vice president, Julian Vance. We are the recipients of the National Infrastructure Award. This woman is an employee of ours who seems to have wandered into the restricted area. She does not have an invitation. We would appreciate it if you could have security escort her out of the building quietly." The hostess looked at my father's card, then looked at me. She didn't look angry. She looked professional. "Ma'am," she asked, addressing me, "do you have your credential?" I didn't say a word. I just handed her my laminated pass, the silver holographic border catching the light of the crystal The hostess took the pass. She looked at the official seal of the Department of Transportation, then raised her digital tablet and aligned the red laser scanner with the black and white QR code printed in the center of the card. The tablet emitted a sharp, high-pitched double chima sound that was completely different from the soft, single beep my father's invitation had made. Instantly, the screen of the tablet flashed a bright, vibrant blue. A security alert popped up, accompanied by an official federal seal and a block of text that was highlighted in red. The hostess froze. Her face, which had been warm and professional, went completely pale. Her eyes widened as she read the information on the screen. She looked at the tablet, then looked up at me, her gaze shifting from professional politeness to a deep, startled reverence. She looked at the Secret Service agent standing beside her. The agent had also heard the distinct double chime. He stepped closer, his hand resting near his belt, his eyes locked on the tablet screen. "Is there a problem?" Arthur asked, his voice rising slightly, a note of impatient authority creeping back in. "As I said, she is just a technician. The pass is obviously a fake." The hostess didn't even look at my father. She ignored him entirely. Her hand was shaking slightly as she held my pass. She looked past me, straight toward the front of the room, where the President of the United States was standing near the podium, speaking with the Secretary of Transportation and a small group of national advisors. She turned to the senior protocol officer standing nearby and spoke into her collar microphone, her voice trembling but clear. Sir, she said, Her eyes locked on me. The technical verification override has been activated. The real guest of honor has arrived. The Secret Service agent stepped forward, not to grab me but to form a protective barrier between me and my father. He looked at Arthur and Julian, his face cold as stone. "Sir, I'm going to have to ask you to step back," the agent said, his voice quiet but carrying the absolute weight of federal authority. Immediately, Arthur's face went from flushed red to a hollow, bloodless gray, his mouth opening and closing like a fish pulled from the cold waters of Lake Erie, while Julian's gold watch seemed to weigh his hand down as it dropped uselessly to his side. The marble corridors of the White House are exceptionally quiet once you step away from the warmth and chatter of the East Room. The sound of our footsteps, the sharp, defensive click of my father's leather dress shoes, the hesitant shuffle of Julian's loafers, and the steady, quiet tread of my flat black shoes echoed off the vaulted ceilings like slow water dripping in an empty cavern. We were led into a small, wood-paneled briefing room just off the main gallery. It wasn't a grand space. There were no oil paintings of past presidents here, just a simple conference table, a few high-backed chairs, and a window looking out into the darkened rose garden. Waiting for us inside was Agent Evelyn Thorne, her silver-streaked hair catching the light of a single brass desk lamp, and a tall, gray-haired man in a dark charcoal suit, whom I recognized from the newspapers as the Deputy Secretary of Transportation. My father didn't wait for the door to close before he let the mask slip. His face was a mottled, angry purple, the veins in his neck bulging against the stiff collar of his custom white shirt. "This is an absolute outrage," he bellowed, his voice shaking the quiet air of the room. He pointed a trembling, manicured finger at me. "This woman is a disgruntled employee. She's my daughter, and she has spent her entire life harboring a bitter, childish jealousy toward her brother. Whatever fraudulent nonsense she has handed your security staff is a lie. I demand to speak to the Chief of Staff immediately. We are the guests of honor." Agent Thorne didn't blink. She didn't raise her voice. She simply pulled a blue-bound folder from her leather briefcase and slid it across the table toward the Deputy Secretary, who sat down and began flipping through the pages with a slow, practiced, deliberate motion. "Mr. Vance," Agent Thorne said, her voice carrying the cold, level weight of a frozen river. "The Department of Transportation's Office of the Inspector General has been reviewing the technical submittals for the Cleveland Harbor project for the past 72 hours. Specifically, we have been examining the patent assignment deed for the acoustic emission fracture mapping protocol." Julian took a step forward, his hand twitching near his gold watch. "That patent is legally registered to Vance Marine Structures. I am the lead inventor of record. The documents are fully executed and filed with the USP. They are executed with a digital tracing of your sister's signature," Agent Thorne replied, looking directly at Julian. Her eyes were completely devoid of pity. "We have the certified forensic document report from the state police examiner. We also have the immutable cryptographic history of the software code from Ms. Vance's private development repository. The SHA-256 security hashes show she created the core mapping algorithms 3 years before you ever joined the executive board, Julian, and more importantly, we have the calibration logs." The Deputy Secretary looked up from the folder, his expression hard. He looked at Julian, then at my father. "Your company submitted a technical addendum yesterday afternoon to resolve our engineering committee's questions. You provided calibration coefficients of 5.9 kilometers per second for the longitudinal wave velocity. Mr. Vance, those are the standard baseline settings for structural aluminum. If we had applied those settings to the marine-grade carbon steel bulkheads in Cleveland, the system would have missed every microscopic stress fracture in the weld seams. Within 18 months, the entire deep-water bulkhead would have suffered a catastrophic structural shear failure under the weight of the winter ice." The silence that followed was absolute. I watched my father's face. If you have ever watched a high-pressure steam pipe slowly develop a hairline fracture, you know the exact moment the metal begins to give way. It doesn't explode right away. First, there is a tiny high-pitched hiss as the strength drains out of it. Arthur Vance looked at the Deputy Secretary, then at the blue folder, and finally at Julian. He saw the truth written in the cold, hard numbers on the page. His golden boy, the vision of the company, didn't even know the difference between aluminum and steel. He had stolen a machine he didn't know how to turn on, and in his arrogance, he had nearly brought a federal disaster down on our family's name. Theo, my father whispered, his voice suddenly sounding thin, stripped of all its booming, practiced warmth. He looked at me, and for the first time in my 39 years, he didn't look down. He looked at me as if I were a stranger who held his life in her rough, scarred hands. Theo, we can talk about this. We're family. We can restructure the patent. We can put your name on the masthead. Think of what your grandfather built. If you do this, the company will die. I looked down at my hands. I thought of the cold winters on the Erie docks, holding the ultrasonic transducer against the freezing steel while my fingers went numb. I thought of the late nights at my kitchen table, drinking lukewarm tea while my back ached, writing the code that they had copy-pasted into a forged deed. I thought of Clara sitting opposite me in her stretched-out, gray cardigan, crying because she was terrified of the monster our father would become when the truth came out. The company was already dying. Dad, I said, my voice quiet but completely unbroken. It died the moment you decided that a lie was easier to sell than the truth. Grandfather didn't build Vance Marine on tailored suits and country club handshakes. He built it on honest welds. And I'm the only one left in this family who still knows how to make one. The deputy secretary closed the blue folder with a soft, decisive. The National Infrastructure Innovation Award for Marine Engineering is suspended, Mr. Vance. The Department of Transportation is freezing all federal disbursements for the Cleveland Harbor contract, pending a full criminal investigation by the Department of Justice. I suggest you contact your corporate counsel. You will not be returning to the East Room tonight. 2 Secret Service agents stepped into the room, their faces expressionless. They didn't use handcuffs. They didn't need to. They simply stood on either side of my father and brother, gesturing toward the private side exit that led out to the street, far away from the cameras, the reporters, and the glittering I watched them walk out. Julian's shoulders were slumped, his expensive Italian suit looking suddenly too large for his frame, while my father walked with the slow, heavy gait of an old man who had finally realized that the ground beneath his feet was gone. I didn't feel a rush of triumph. I didn't feel the need to smile or gloat. If you've ever had to cut a damaged limb off a tree to save the trunk, you know that you don't celebrate the saw. You just feel the quiet, heavy relief of knowing that the rot has finally stopped. I know some of you are doing this exact math at your own kitchen tables right now. You're holding a pen, looking at the names of the people who should have protected you, wondering if you have the strength to be the one who finally draws the line. You're afraid of the coldness that comes after. But let me tell you what happens when you finally stand your ground. The world doesn't end. The air just gets a little clearer. You find out that the people who spent their lives trying to make you feel small were actually terrified of how large you really are. The fallout was quiet, methodical, and complete. To save the 82 families in Erie who relied on Vance Marine for their mortgages and their grocery bills, I didn't let the company dissolve. I spent the next 6 months in federal offices in Pittsburgh and Washington, working alongside Agent Thorne and a team of court-appointed trustees. We negotiated a deferred prosecution agreement. Under the terms of the settlement, Arthur and Julian were forced to legally divest themselves of every single share of Vance Marine's stock, transferring their ownership entirely to a voting trust managed jointly by me and Clara. Julian pleaded guilty to a single felony count of making false statements to a federal agency. Because of his lack of a prior record, he avoided prison, but he was sentenced to 3 years of supervised probation, 500 hours of community service cleaning the industrial waste along the Ohio River, and a personal fine that forced him to sell his lakeside condo and his luxury car. He lives in a small apartment in Cleveland now, working as an assistant manager for a commercial shipping company. He doesn't play golf anymore. Arthur retired quietly to a small 2-bedroom cottage on the shores of Lake Erie, about 20 miles west of the yard. The big house on the hill, the one with the manicured lawns and the stone pillars, was liquidated to pay the federal fines and the mountain of legal fees. The yard in Erie is still running. We changed the name on the rusted iron gate to *Vance Structural Integrity and Engineering*. I didn't take my grandfather's name off the sign. I just took the lies out from behind it. I sit in the front office now, but my desk is still piled high with raw data sheets, and my work boots are still parked near the door. Clara left her teaching job to manage our human resources and community outreach. And for the first time in 30 years, the people who actually sweat in the fabrication shop are paid a living wage with healthcare that doesn't require a union strike to secure. Last month, on a cold, gray Tuesday, when the wind off the lake was carrying the first smell of winter snow, I drove out to Arthur's cottage. I didn't have to go, but steel that has been tempered properly doesn't hold on to the heat of the forge forever. It cools. It stabilizes. He was sitting on his small wooden porch, wrapped in a faded wool blanket, watching the dark, white-capped waves roll in from the horizon. His silver hair was longer now, and his hands were trembling slightly as he held a cheap ceramic mug of instant coffee. He looked smaller than I remembered. The custom-tailored blazers were gone, replaced by a simple flannel shirt that looked too large for his thin shoulders. I walked up the wooden steps, my work boots thudding softly on the pine boards. I didn't say a word. I just sat down in the empty wicker chair beside him and set a thermos of hot, fresh-brewed chicory coffee on the small table between us. He didn't look at me for a long time. He just watched the gray water. I thought I was building something that would last. "Theo," he said, his voice barely louder than the rustle of the dry oak leaves in the yard. I thought the name was everything. I reached over and touched his hand. His skin was dry, cold, and paper-thin, a stark contrast to the warm, rough strength in my own palms. I didn't tell him I forgave him. I didn't tell him that what he did was okay, because it wasn't, and we both knew it. But I didn't pull my hand away either. The name only lasts if the welds hold. "Dad!" I said softly, looking out at the endless gray horizon where the water met the cold sky. We sat there in the quiet of the lakeside afternoon, two people who had shared a name and a lifetime of silence, finally listening to the steady, honest sound of the lake hitting the shore, knowing that love is a gift, not a line item in a budget.